Galapagos. It was great. It's a 2-day tournament, so day one today.
Oh man, all the jealousy of being an Alaskan golfer and listening to all my friends play all year long and me just sitting here waiting for winter to end.
Soon.
Yeah, soon-ish. We'll see. Maybe May if we're lucky. So yeah, I know I'm excited to have you on the show, man. I think this could be really cool. And I mean, we have so many snowbirds that go down to the greater Phoenix area that are avid golfers. And I mean, what better way to give people more clarity on what exactly a real fitting process is like? And I just want to have a basic conversation about how you kind of got your start with it, not only in golf, but also in master fitting. And then I'll probably ask you some curveball questions and make you think off your feet. And then,
Yeah.
I'll make sure to attach your contact info at the end of the podcast and everything, and try to get everybody to come down and see you. You're still over at Talking Stick, aren't you?
Yeah, right at the back of the range over at Talking Stick at the Academy.
Yeah, yeah. And how'd you get your start when it comes to just being in the golf world? I mean, did you play as a kid, or did you just kind of start on your own?
Yeah, I mean, played when I was younger for sure, but when in the comparisons a thief of joy, but when I compare myself to some of my peers, probably late in the game, I really truly picked it up later in high school and was okay. And then I kind of figured out that I really loved it
Mhm.
and went to school, and then decided I want to become a club professional. So I was a club professional back home in New Mexico in Albuquerque. So I was a first assistant and managed the outside. Did that for probably 4 years or so, 3 or 4 years. Did a little bit of teaching, nothing full time by any means, but mainly ran the tournaments and ran the golf shop, stuff like that as a golf professional. Then I moved out here to the Valley about 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, yeah. And when I first came out here, I was actually building golf clubs for a competitor of ours. Um, and then was fitting with them for about 2 years. And then I've now been with True Spec for a little over four.
Huh. And so is that kind of the path most people take if they're going into being kind of a club fitter and trying to attain that master club fitter status? Is do they a lot of people start with building first?
I wouldn't say a lot. There's certainly a handful of them, and from my point of view, and again, partial to obviously, but like that would be ideal because then you fully understand how a golf club is assembled, what components do to the weight of it, to the length of it, to swing weight, what alters what, and what shafts fit into what, and you have a really just a better idea of the overall build,
Mhm.
which then could help with the fit for sure, to an extent. But yeah, I think it's really important to understand the tools.
And just the basic fundamentals, especially as technology starts to change even more so than it has in the last 10, 15 years, which I mean, obviously those leaps and bounds have been pretty astronomical, but when it comes to building clubs and understanding, well, this club head is designed for X, Y, and Z, so perhaps this shaft may not work in it.
Yeah, for sure. And then you talk about shaft diameter, tipping a golf shaft. Like, what does tipping a golf shaft actually mean, and what does it do? Um, just little things like that. That in the fitting, like now, it's kind of second nature for me. But in the fitting, I absolutely think about it. If people are right on the cusp of a regular and a stiff, you could always tip something or soft step something or hard step something to kind of achieve that certain ideal flex for someone. And then from the building standpoint, you understand really what's achievable and what's possible.
Yeah, and so you go through you build clubs for a couple years, and then obviously you did some fitting at a
Yep,
competitor, True Spec.
yep.
And then what was really the okay, I want to make this switch over to True Spec, and this is where I've been now for the last X amount of years. And you're now obviously, like you said, the master club fitter over at Talking Stick, which is a beautiful facility that you were able to fit me at last year.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to know a little bit more, like why True Spec for you.
Yeah, for me, from a professional standpoint, where I was at, it was wonderful. At my experience, it was great. But I was wanting growth and a little bit more opportunity, and I knew True Spec was really, really growing. And then under the 8 a.m. umbrella, there's tons of opportunity there as well. So I think our reach within the golf community was fairly significant, and still continues to be. And so for me, it was a no-brainer with the amount of locations, who I knew was there, and kind of went over there and have enjoyed it ever since, honestly.
You mentioned something that you said the 8 a.m. umbrella. What is that?
So 8 a.m. is our parent company, and underneath the 8 a.m. umbrella, um, there's probably 7 golf brands, maybe a little bit more. I'd have to double check. Don't quote me on that. But you have golf.com, you have Golf Magazine, you have True Spec, you have 3Js, which is Justin Timberlake's par threes, and then you have Golf Logics, you have Chirp, which is a betting app, you have Jack Nicklaus Companies,
Hmm.
and then you have, I think I'm missing one or two. You got Mira, the North American distribution rights to Mira Golf, which is the fine forged irons. Um, there's probably a handful of other things. Uh,
And that Mira partnership is a fairly big deal because they're still headquartered out of Japan.
Correct.
And so, I mean, any distributor in the United States, like a TaylorMade, Callaway, Titleist, it's not something you need a distribution partnership with per se, but for Mira, that's kind of a big deal.
Correct. Yeah. So we're the exclusive distributor for Mira Golf,
Wow. I mean, that's pretty cool, especially when you see
and that would be 8 a.m. Not True Spec, but yes.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's pretty cool though, because you saw the footage of Adam Scott building his clubs over at the Miura facility. Now, we all can't have that luxurious of a life,
No.
but you know, to get the closest kind of comparison without having to fly all the way to Japan is a pretty unique aspect for you guys.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And then
So,
obviously, since my time at True Spec and being around, my opinion, some of the smartest fitters and gearheads, if you will, within the industry, you just absorb, and that's always been my philosophy. Is if I'm not fitting, it's seeking avenues within the company and even a little bit of outside the company, whether it's podcasts, whatever it is, just to absorb as much as possible with new tech, new information. Fitting philosophy, there's so many different things, but I think it's important to continue just growing in your craft for sure.
yeah, and so um I mean, take me back to kind of the start of fitting essentially. Like, you know, I don't know how much of a big deal or access the public had to it. You know, I mean, in the late '90s or early '90s, it seemed like you were kind of just buying stuff off of the rack, right? And unless you were playing on tour, or going to Golf Galaxy or PGA Tour Superstore, which you could still do today, a lot of the general public didn't have access to this kind of an experience.
Definitely. I think, I mean, now you start talking about adjustability in club heads, right? So like
Right.
that's kind of the first step, more or less, to, well, what does an open face do? What does a this setting of the driver, of the three wood, so on and so forth, do to the golf ball? Then you start tweaking a whole bunch of things, and then I think launch monitors obviously had a huge impact on our industry. So there's just takes away any sort of guessing. Now, all of that stuff is valuable information, but if you don't know what's important within that information, then you could go down a rabbit hole pretty quickly from an equipment standpoint.
Yeah.
But I would say, I think between launch monitors and adjustability and woods, if you will, kind of made our industry boom for sure and really grow. And now you have OEMs, whether it's TaylorMade, Callaway, Ping, PXG, whoever it is, they're pushing for a custom fit golf club. Now there's certain things that we do differently than they do, but no matter what, I think it's important to have an idea of general flex, right? General weight of the shaft, general length of the shaft. That's fitting kind of 101, if you will. And obviously lie angle, set makeup, all those things. We just kind of go up a little bit more in detail.
Sure. And I mean, as time goes on, you know, you guys are obviously right there on the cutting edge, but do you guys have access to feedback from like the guys that are in the tour trucks and maybe they're doing something completely unique and you might get some kind of access to, well, you know, here's a new technique that we determined that was working really well on tour, because obviously the tour guys are going to get everything first.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, they get their stuff, and sometimes it has badging on it. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes just hit this, tell us what you think. You can't even play it for another 2 months. And honestly, some of them don't like when that happens because if they love the product of whoever it's from, they know they can't play it for a little bit because it may not be on the conforming list yet or things like that. But in general, we work with a handful of, and quite a bit of LPGA and PGA and champions and your elite, college golfers. So for sure, feedback from them is super important, and you always, you make sure you listen whenever you do those sessions with them. Above all, before you try and fix anything, you listen to their feedback on whatever it is. But I think their feedback is absolutely vital to the quality of product. Number one, does it perform? If you see it on TV in anyone's bag on any tour, any high college tournament, I think that matters, and I think that's important. If TaylorMade and Callaway and Ping and all of them get a good success rate on any of the tours, I think that also backs up what the public sees. And if the public sees that, then it's good for them to come see us, and it kind of just snowballs from there. But obviously, it starts with a good product, which starts from good feedback from their tour professionals.
Sure. And so, what does a typical process look like when someone comes in for a fitting with you? What time of the year should they be coming in regards to their, how well they're playing, or is this something like we should just book it in the wintertime, or what do you like to tell people before you come to fit?
That's a great question, especially from Alaska, right? So it's there isn't a cut and dry answer to my honest opinion, which is a kind of a cop out answer. But I would say in general, you should come when you feel like you're swinging the best. I think that's important to have a good idea of what is the club doing when I'm swinging the best, or what is the ball doing rather. And you'll have misses and all that, but I think that's kind of number one. So like for Alaska, maybe towards the end of summer is when you want to come, right? If you come at beginning of spring, and maybe you have some winter swings, maybe you don't, maybe you've hit some off turf, but unlikely, then I think it could change the fitting, like drastically. And then the other part is be mindful of product release cycles. Generally, you're going to have your new product is going to be in the spring, so February or March release times. So coming up on new woods, we're in December now, so new woods are going to be released here in the next couple months. But in general, you should always come in for a fitting when you're feeling the most comfortable and the most confident in whatever your ability is.
And so, for instance, like I got fit with you last spring, and you know, I had been fit even just 2 years prior to that, and we ended up fitting into, ironically, a lighter shaft and driver and heavier shaft and irons. I mean, it now depending on your skill level, obviously, like how often would someone want to be at least just getting a checkup?
Yeah, it's another good question. I get that one a lot. 3 to 5 years is a good kind of rule of thumb. So 3 years, let's make sure loft and lie is right. Did the swing change drastically? Did speed go up and down? Uh, I'd call that just kind of a checkup. And I have people that come in yearly, especially here in Scottsdale, get your snowbirds. So they'll come in right after the holiday season to kind of check up on things. But probably 5 years, something has happened,
Hmm.
whether you have changed or golf equipment has changed, new shaft, new driver, whatever it is, something for sure has happened, and there's a chance you're missing out. So 3 to 5 years, three is a good checking point. Five, you're missing out on something because you likely have changed, and not necessarily in a good or bad way, but in some way. And then equipment for sure has changed. There's been some sort of advancement in technology to gain, some forgiveness, maybe some more ball speed, whatever it is, some distance, some height, kind of whatever you're seeking.
Right. And obviously as you go up that scale from, let's say, anything that's stock that you can go just direct to your sporting store to get versus custom, you're kind of hitting a different price point depending on what it is. But I mean, if somebody came in and said, well, these are kind of my budget items, you're able to somewhat work within that framework based upon all the shaft selection you guys have typically.
Oh, 100%. We do it all, from your very, very high-end equipment, completely custom. We build it, we control it. Two people touch your golf clubs from a building standpoint. to the other side of it where, I have golfers in there that, you know, I've started fittings with, how do I hold this club? I'm like, ooh, this is going to be, it could be a long one, but you want to make it enjoyable, and you don't want to make it, um, you really don't want to make it uncomfortable for them, because they're new golfers. I'm a stranger. You get a stranger and a new golfer, watching them hit a golf ball, it's terrifying for most people,
Yeah.
right? So at that point, it's well, let's just get you into the right set makeup. You're allowed 14. You probably don't need 14 clubs, but let's get you 10. And it'd be a positive sign if I get a call or text or an email from you that says, hey, I have gaps now. That'd be great, right? And at that point, especially for your new golfers or your golfers who play 5 to 20 times a year, maybe somewhere in there, it could be a stock equipment. And we have no issue doing that. And we do some of that for sure. Get a, because then you have a good idea of flex and length and loft and lie, and like those are your basic stuff. The game grabs you, start playing more, come back, and we could really comb through this data and the golf swing and things like that a little bit more in depth.
Right. And that was going to be my next question. Obviously, you get a brand new golfer in there, it's like having first tee jitters almost
Terrifying.
150 times. And so to have that privately though, I mean, we've all seen, at various golf stores where can I try this? And the guy takes you over there and you've got 20 people shopping around you watching you shank one into the wall. So it can be a little bit more of a friendlier setting if it's just a one-on-one situation.
Yeah, I think it's important. There's places, whether you're a member somewhere or you're not, like there's demo days held at most golf courses, and you go to those demo days, and it's their job to push that product on you. And again, back to our conversation earlier, they're getting better at like isolating an hour block just for you, right? As opposed to 5 people at a time checking that out, checking that. It looks good, looks good. But with what we do, it's come in, we carry all OEMs, all major manufacturers. I don't really, I don't care what works. I do care and I want something to work. But in terms of brand, I have no loyalty. Uh, I work for True Spec, so that's what I want to fit you into, is whatever's the best. And so that's the other benefit of coming to us, is you don't have to chase down demo days. You have everything underneath one building, and completely brand agnostic club fitting, from your really custom to your stock 10 golf clubs, 11 golf clubs for your new golfer, maybe less for some of your juniors who I work with too as well sometimes.
Right. And that's now a big piece as time has somewhat gone on. You're more likely seeing more and more tour players that are becoming more brand agnostic and playing multiple manufacturers within their bag. And I mean, you go back to, 2000s Tiger. I mean, it was just straight Nike. So everyone just
Oh,
ran out and bought Nike. And
yeah.
it's, now, you're seeing people use a multitude of things. And I think, you can speak to this, but there are certain things that maybe manufacturers will just do better than other manufacturers. And tour players recognize that agnostic ideology that they can take with them to tour.
There's no question. And you look at, I mean, I think most people maybe shouldn't, because it's speed dependent, but maybe shouldn't pay attention to PGA. Most should probably honestly pay attention to the LPGA golfers. And honestly, some of them even have too much speed for anyone to be looking at. But point being, if you look at what they're playing, you could start kind of stiffing out if you really deep dive into it, like what product is good that year,
Yeah.
right? So, and the touring professionals are getting, uh, they understand that the tools that they carry, unless you're your very top 50 guys, they rather just make cuts, and make their money playing. And if that means, one OEM in the irons, the other OEM in the 5 wood, the other OEM in the 3 wood, that's really beneficial for them. If at the end of the year, they keep their card, or whatever it is, whatever goals that they have, that ultimately trumps the dollar amount that whoever OEM was going to maybe cut a check.
Right. And I recall playing in a 4-ball qualifier actually in Phoenix at Wigwam this fall
Oh, yeah.
with two guys that were on a tour truck for a certain manufacturer. And they flat out told us that we will not catch that brand in distance with our drivers. But we do this really, really well. And that is where make up for it is why some guys prefer to play our stuff versus maybe that. Now, you can push all the brands you want, but if it doesn't fit you, it doesn't matter, right?
I completely agree. And like specifically, this year I noticed there are so many. I mean, well, Vokey is obviously a great one to look at, right?
Right.
That's one that comes to mind. You're going to see a Vokey wedge likely in someone's bag, whether they're on Titleist staff or not. And it could just be the one. It could be a 60, whatever it is, but you're likely going to see one. The other one is TaylorMade fairway woods. You just typically see a lot of them. Now, does that mean that they're the best? Not always. That's kind of we'll come in and find out type thing. But you do see a lot of them in non-staffers bags.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what you said about launch monitor technology and just how much that has changed in the last 15 years. Because for a long time, fittings tended to just be the eye test, right? Okay, what does it
It's
look
good.
like to the eye, right?
Yeah,
But when you really get into it, you may have a straight ball that is just ballooning, and that's great, but what are you giving up versus what are you getting? And
for
so
sure.
what are some of those key points that you guys are typically looking at when it comes to, what numbers are we looking for in specifics to this person? And that's going to vary on speed, I know, but most people just, you hear them say, well, I bought this shaft off of my friend Bobby and it's working so much better. And you're like, but is it really working better or is it not?
I know it's interesting. So like one, everything that we do, the data matters, and the decisions as fitters that we make is data driven, right? So how I start off fitting is and obviously you've been through one with myself is you pay attention to look, sound, feel. Does it look good? Does it feel good? Does it sound good? Because all of that is completely subjective. I'll pay attention to the numbers, and objectively, it's doing this, right? And so, from a player dynamics and speed and stuff like that, kind of what you said, it changes person to person. But some of the key things I look at as a fitter are descent angles, kind of the main one, and efficiency, right? And there's a whole bunch underneath those two. But if I'm looking at a launch monitor, those are the first things I'm looking at: efficiency, or TrackMan calls it smash factor, and then descent angle. Did they hit the center? Are they maximizing the ball speed for their club head speed? That's kind of the measurement of efficiency or smash factor. And then descent angle is it coming down properly? The ball, not the club. Is it falling steep? Is it gonna roll? And then from there you could kind of make some other changes as needed. But descent angle really tells the story of the ball speed, the launch, and the spin. And then you have the efficiency is really, did they hit it square, and are we missing somewhere?
And even that to an extent, let me ask, can that be subjective as well? Because obviously, you can't really, like you said, go by tour standards because if they're playing in a different country every month, they may want something that descends extremely quick when they're playing in Florida in a humid place, but then they go play in the British Open, they may want something with a flatter ball flight that rolls a little bit further, and that may constitute some kind of equipment change that the normal person just won't have access to.
Absolutely, like 100%. And I think so that question exactly, from a fitting standpoint, part of what we do and what I do is somewhat of an interview process. It's not formal, things like that, but while you're warming up, where are you playing your golf? Is it here in Arizona? Is it in Alaska? Is it in Chicago? We get a lot of Midwesterners over here. Is it in Florida? Whatever it is. So then I have a better idea of playing conditions, and then you could kind of default point if you start completely disregarding height, for example, or spin. You're at some point they are missing out on something, but it gives you at least a rough idea of where to err, if anything.
Right.
Um, and so I think that absolutely matters on where they're playing their golf.
And so let me ask you this. What's the hardest shot to hit in golf?
Hardest shot to hit in golf. Um, oof.
Consistently.
I mean, a 60-yard bunker shot.
Oh, 60-yard bunker shot. I was thinking more along the lines of a straight ball, Mark, because I
Yeah,
I know
straight.
you ask a lot, like hey, if you're going to miss, how do you want to miss?
Yeah, for sure. for sure. Because then
because
you can talk about other things for sure.
right. And then you say, well, if in my case, I'd prefer if my miss is going to be left so I can plan for it versus, that snap right hook for a left-handed player or that left-hand hook for a right-handed player. I mean, it seems like, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but more and more tour players are leaving the obsession with hitting a baby draw and saying, I'm going to play this fade. I mean, Scott
Yeah, I mean,
Scheffler is a big one.
yeah, you get a lot of those guys now with that'd be a little bit kind of in the swing dynamic stuff, but in general, with the speeds that they're at, um, if they want to hit it like quote unquote straight, like you have to spin the golf ball a little
Mhm,
bit more than maybe what's optimal.
mhm.
And if you spin the golf ball enough, or if you're trying to spin the golf ball, you're likely going to want to cut it a little bit. Um, there's drawers of it for sure. And if you look who's drawing the golf ball, you'll notice that their swing speed, when compared to maybe the higher guys on tour, maybe a little bit lower, right? So they're really just trying to maximize everything. There's outliers, Rory being the first one.
Right,
That's an
right,
outlier.
obviously. Yeah, 5'10", good luck.
But majority of those guys start to cut it because it spins a little bit more, and I think it's controllable. Um, but straight is really hard, and I think some of the LPGA and PJ girls and guys that I've worked with, it is very impressive on how straight their golf ball is, and I think the public maybe thinks it's a lot of movement.
Mhm.
Um, no, don't get me wrong; they're more than capable of moving it whichever way they want, but their golf shots that they hit are the ball doesn't move; it'll fall a yard or two to the right or to the left. And so I think you start to realize like what straight actually is, and then how much curvature is actually a lot of curvature. Watching, that's obviously the bar. Um, but yeah, I think your guys now, and maybe not the girls, but a lot of the guys are. You see a lot of cut moves on it for sure.
And so, I mean, what would you expect as your fitting process might change after this, new rollback of the golf ball, don't you say? I mean, I know that the golf ball plays such an important part in, for whatever reason, amateurs most of the time are not playing the right golf ball, right?
Yeah,
We all think we need a Pro V1, but sometimes we don't. And I find that very interesting. And at least from where your location is, that to me is more of a okay, if it meets the numbers test, does it meet the eye test? Maybe someone that hasn't even considered what golf ball they're playing, a good option would be at one of the indoor fitting facilities so that they could try multiple balls and say, well, that ain't it, you know.
totally. I mean, you've seen it. We're unbelievably spoiled with what we have, and Talking Stick's great to us, and we have a wonderful facility there. And we use the premium golf balls. And don't get me wrong, like that premium golf ball isn't always the 100% spot on one for whoever doing the fitting, but it's probably better than range ball.
Right.
And so I would say majority of people, like especially at your lower speeds, uh, don't spin the golf ball enough.
Hmm.
But from a fitting standpoint, it's a fine line because if you start giving them too much spin, they're going to gain so much control, but they may lose the distance, and then you're actually inhibiting them for lower scores. And so it's a fine line, and it's always teetering that line. Do you want to hit it further, or do you want to hit it, maybe half a club shorter but way straighter? Everyone has different answers, and I don't think there's a right or wrong one.
No, that's an interesting concept. I mean, I remember the first fitting I ever did before I ever fit with you,
Yeah,
by a guy named Eric, and I remember he said, "What golf ball do you play?" It's like, "Well, I've either got the BXS or the AVX." He goes, "Well, so you've got the lowest spinning
yeah,
ball and you've got the highest spinning ball." He goes, "That doesn't make a whole ton of sense." And I was like, "Well, maybe I'll just hit a few and you can kind of tell me." And
yeah.
that was kind of true to test, right? Like I just bought a BXS golf ball, like a sleeve of them at the golf course because I saw Tiger Woods use it, and I was like, "Well,
So
that was."
there's a guy who likes to spin it though.
Yeah, yeah, and you have no idea. But like I don't nearly have the same control as Tiger Woods, and most of us never will. So,
Sure.
I mean, that could be worth it in and of itself. Here's an interesting question for you: how much money have you saved people by them coming to do a fitting rather than going to just a sporting goods store and picking stuff off the rack?
Oof. You can send a couple kids through college, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some of our clients too, especially with some of them and how much they play and whether they're betting or things like that, and really just kind of making sure the club is right. Never mind the return process, things like that. But I think it's I think it's a pretty sizable amount. Again, if that's part of the interview process, don't I mean it where it's is it 5 times a year and it's company scrambles? Because that changes the fitting a little bit. You still want to make sure loft and all those things are correct, but does it have to be this exact profile of shaft? Unlikely.
Mhm.
But does it, need to be the right flex in general? Absolutely. Then you get your guys, who are 50 to 100 to, 200 rounds a year people. And it's like, yeah, let's do this right once, right? Let's do it right once and see me in 3 years, see me in 5 years, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, and you're not afraid to tell someone, yeah, I probably wouldn't replace that club.
Again, back to, data rules everything. There's the science or the math, if it backs it and the person likes it and it does what it's supposed to do, which happens, especially with your better players, then it is what it is, right? If efficiency is maxed out and the launch conditions are ideal, it's a simple conversation of, well, what are you seeking? And then you could kind of explain from there on what's possible and maybe what may change. But for most people, once you look at those, back to efficiency and descent and whatever they're using it for, it's a pretty simple conversation.
And so on that level, obviously you guys work with a wide range of playing ability.
Yeah.
And, from let's say, most complicated to highest complicated, in what range do you say, hey, are elite amateur golfers easier to work with than brand new golfers, or is it just more of a roadmap based upon where their skill level is at the time?
Yeah, I get this one quite a bit too. I would say the best kind of clients on our end from a easy fitting type thing is your 10 handicap or so, maybe even 11 or 12, because that they're doing the same thing over and over. They have a pattern, and sometimes equipment can really, really help that pattern by a significant measurable amount. Once you get to your scratch or plus, your never mind your tour guys, but your scratch or plus people, they don't have that bad of equipment to get to scratch or plus. And so you're changing, very minimal things. Are you increasing spin with the driver by 500, by 200, by 300? Are you changing descent angle with irons, bounce configuration with wedges, like very, very subtle things? But at a plus, or a zero handicap, those subtle things, it's a quarter shot, it's a half a shot potentially, and then you start spreading it out over a bunch of rounds and you realize like, yeah, I'm playing a little bit better.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So like those guys that are maybe elite amateurs, like you said, scratch plus or even low single digits, they may not see, a 10 shot difference. What they're
No.
looking for is that maybe that one shot or two shots, in a round that will really make the difference. And I mean, it kind of just goes to say that it is so hard to get so much better when you get to a five and below because it's a matter of one shot. So that 10 to 12 really is an ideal spot to say, hey, if I've grown up with these clubs my dad got me from, the time I was 18 years old and I'm a 10 or a 12, I should probably really look into this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I said, that 10 to 12 is it's worth it at that point for sure. You've gotten good enough. And really when you start to know, the one thing we get is, am I good enough for fitting? And the answer is always yes. Like I
Right.
promise you, you are good enough. I've seen it all and I've worked with it all. But once you get to that 10 to a 12 and you start playing a lot more and you may plateau, right? Whether you're working with an instructor or not, if you're like, yeah, my scores, they are what they are and they're not getting much better. At that time, like that's a great time to at least look at your equipment. That's not to say that it's way off. It certainly could be you, but it's a checking point and it's a variable that you could control. And I think that's the most important part to what we do is it's not always the driver's fault. It's not always the iron's fault. Sometimes it is, but it's having the answer. and realizing it through the fitting process that, oh yeah, stuff really is significantly better than what I had. Or, okay, well now I know what I need to work on, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think when I did my first fitting with Eric at your old location right across from TPC, I'd never done a fitting. I just bought stuff off the shelf as
Yeah.
usual, all stiff, right? Because it's impossible to find extra stiff from a store for the most part.
I mean, you'd be a good
And
example for it. You're hard.
yeah, and like, he said, "Well, what's your handicap?" And I said, I'm like a 5 or a 6." And he goes, "How?" And
Yeah.
well, okay, fine. You give me, the custom set of clubs that are fit to what I do, and yeah, I'm able to shave, 4 or 5 shots off of my handicap, but that still took 3 years. And so it's not an overnight process. I want to
No,
emphasize.
no, by any means. It's kind of what you said. You add shots to it though. So I play my golf. I'm like a 1 to a 3. It fluctuates here and there, but there are certain shots for sure that like I realize now, like I just don't, I just don't have. And from an equipment standpoint, obviously being a fitter, I'm like, does this? And I'm like, no, it's you. And so,
Yeah.
but it's knowing and things like that, it's just a variable that you can control, and it's important to have checked.
And so some of that is as much, okay, let's get the equipment dialed in, but when I'm coming into this, I need to have the right mindset that this won't solve all of my golf woes. And some of that may be up in my head and something I need to work with a teaching professional on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have wonderful partners and that we work with, never mind within the Phoenix area, but across the U.S. from an instructional standpoint, that are always in touch with us. And me as a fitter, if you're working with someone, I want to know who, and then I want to know what you're working on. Not to say they're wrong or right by any means, but to find out, during the fitting, do I err on whatever you guys are working on? That ultimately this is what they're trying to get you to do, and if the data validates that that's probably correct, then it's important to have that conversation with that instructor, and then also with the client that I'm with at the time. And you'll get people that bring their instructor with them, and I have no problem. I have no problem with that, and I actually invite it.
So I want to ask you before we move away from the golf clubs specifically, but something when people say fitting, most of the time they think about, my wedges, my fairway woods. Everyone wants to talk about getting a new driver fitting, right? If you had to pick, between, driver, fairway woods, irons, and wedges, if you're running on a budget or whatever it is, which one do you think could provide the most value to maybe get fit at for first?
Oh, that is so hard. That is a really, really good question. One, I think it depends on ability. Number one, like where like are we brand new to it? Are we 15 handicap? And then the other part would be, maybe speed stuff. Like at your speeds, are you getting enough out of your drivers? Kind of where I like to start.
Hmm.
If you gain someone at the lower speeds 20 yards, like that's drastically different. And you don't see it all the time, but you see 20 or 30 yards here and there. Maybe once a month you get a client like that, and that's 3 clubs, and that really, really changes things. A 6 iron or a 9 iron into a par 4, those are absolutely different clubs. Then you start talking about proximity and height and control and all those things. Um, I would say the number one thing to look at, though, whew, I'd probably say get your putter at least looked at. It's putter or driver.
That's exactly where I was going with was putter.
Yeah, it's putter
We
driver.
tend
It's
to
both ends
ignore
of the
that.
bag for me.
Yeah, we tend to ignore the flat stick the most when we're talking about getting fittings. And so I wanted to get your unique perspective on what people really need to understand about when they're getting a putter, because it's so overlooked as, that's the one club in your bag you're going to use every hole no matter what.
For sure. You could spend $600 on a driver, or you could spend, you know, 200 or 100 on a putter, and maybe the same results type thing, right? So I think from a value standpoint, you get a lot out of the putter fitting for sure. But in general, what we see, I mean, you look at the number one player in the world, he switched to a mallet and got pretty successful with it. So I think majority of people, and I'm aware this is kind of a blanket statement, but I think majority of people should be in a mallet.
Yeah, and some of that comes down to just how people make their strokes, right? I mean, the blade putters are obviously a classic, and sometimes that stroke maybe is it's all mental from the way you look at a putter. Like you said, it look good. Does it feel good? Do you feel like it's smooth? And that's probably the hardest thing to gauge from a putting perspective. So how do you help people work through that?
I think again back to on our world, back to the data part. So we kind of deal with a flat 10-footer. We start looking at face angles, which in putting rules everything. So the path and how it gets there, don't get me wrong, there's better paths from a roll standpoint and efficiency standpoint and stuff like that. But ultimately, that golf ball is going to go wherever that club face is pointing.
Mhm.
And so having face control of the putter because it's such a low speed is everything in our world. And I think a mallet with really, really stable kind of the back end and maybe some perimeter weighting stuff like that can disguise some mishits. It could also disguise maybe some um, speed issues. And then it's just much easier to start online. Um, Now, don't get me wrong. There's people who are pure blades. They just want to hit a blade, and that's fine. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. But you start looking at maybe the inconsistency of speed and or strike. Right. It's the same with the blade irons. You have to flush those. Um, and most, the guys who play it for the most part they know what they're doing from what we see. But it's the same with the putter. And I think where people with blades may get exposed is when you slightly miss it. Just like when you miss hit a 6-7 iron bladed iron, you slightly miss it, you're going to be penalized quite a bit more versus maybe a mallet. But yeah, from our fitting process, it's take a look at the length, the loft, the lie. Are they set up properly? That will influence those things. You try not to throw your teaching hat on. Every once in a while, you want to make sure they're at least somewhat in the right area of a setup standpoint. From a putter design, you have to like what you look at, right? When you set it down, there's some mallets out there that are
Yeah.
aggressive, uh,
Less than
and
ideal.
yeah, but what I have found is I have met um, so many people that are unbelievably frustrated with their putting specifically, right? They could hit it 260, 270, 280, give them a 4 or 5 footer, and who knows? So at that point, they're like, I don't care if it's shaped like a tomato, whatever it is. They don't care. They just want it to go in. And so when we come in with an open mind and rely on the data and stuff like that, then it makes things significantly easier.
Yeah, so and when you're talking about, everyone wants to hit the big bomb like they see on TV, but that putting aspect is probably, like I said, so underemphasized in its ability to shave strokes off your game that,
Absolutely.
sometimes we kind of put that to the side, or you see the guy with 10 different putters and he's playing in a scramble. He's like, I didn't bring my other putter today, and it's like, well, I mean, go get fit. It's easy. You can see people that have really good golf swings, and they'll just have the same misses over and over. And the first question I'll typically ask is, have you been fit? And the answer is no. So
We get that often. And really what we see too, what I've noticed is if I've never worked with anyone from a driver, we never did irons, we never did wedges, we never did anything, but we've done putter. Usually they're little the positives and the negatives of their golf swing are in their putting stroke in some capacity. So
wow,
your drawers of the golf ball are generally going to be your maybe the people who hit blocks with putters, but they're from the inside and maybe they just kind of leave that face open a little bit. Every once in a while they'll tug it, but more often than not, it's kind of blocked. You
that's
start to
super
ask them, like,
interesting.
"Do you draw the golf ball?" They're like, "Yeah." Well, yeah, I mean that makes sense.
That's so fascinating. I'd never thought about that before. Like,
Yeah,
and I think even Charlie Woods like said to his dad, like, when you miss, you pull. But I mean, Tiger's obviously God.
sure.
I can't
Sure.
go any direction there. But if you think about where your really bad misses are, I mean, that makes complete sense because you're inadvertently, just making a smaller swing.
Yeah, it's a micro swing of what your big swing really does, right?
Wow.
But ideally, your best putters are going to be ones who limit limit gate or open and close of the putter face, because then you take away timing.
And some of that is just, length. I mean, length obviously plays a big deal, right? You probably see a ton of people that are in the completely wrong shaft length of a putter most times.
You see a lot of 35-inch putters for people who need 33 or 34 and a half type thing, right? The depth of a golf bag, I'm pretty sure, is right around 35 inches. And I think one of our Chris McCormick, who was our VP of Tour, who's now since moved on, but he actually told me, he said, yeah, the length of the putter is 35 inches because the depth of the golf bag was at 1.35 inches, and so that's just kind of where it started.
Wow.
Well, again, I don't know if that's absolutely true, but I do think that most people should probably be in a shorter putter.
Interesting. And I mean, does that start from height or does that start from just the way that they move the club?
Um, Probably a little bit of both, I would say.
Hmm.
Yeah, probably a little bit of both. Um, but I think shorter for most people to get them over the golf ball, get their spine angle a little bit better,
Hmm.
is beneficial. And
Interesting.
yeah,
So that's all really fascinating to hear that information. I want to go back to just one more thing.
yeah,
TrackMan and Foresight, two extremely amazing machines that do
yeah,
two completely different things in regards to how that's done. They try to tell you the data in a similar fashion, but obviously TrackMan being radar technology and Foresight using, its quadroscopic camera system, two totally unique ways of gaining data, creating data, and then regurgitating it to you. If what are the pros and kind of the cons to saying, well, maybe I want one system over another, and most of the time I'm just curious. They say TrackMan is better for outdoors fittings versus Foresight might be better inside. Does it just vary?
yeah, that's fair. One, they're both wonderful launch monitor products, and we use both. We do have partners within our locations that we have across the U.S. that we do have locations there, and we use TrackMan. But majority of what we use is GC Quad, and they are different. Exactly what you said, different technologies. I think this is again a little bit my opinion. It's not right or wrong. I think the quad that we use is really, really wonderful at measuring golf clubs,
Hmm.
and that's what we fit, and that's what we change. Now that club obviously produces the ball flight, but I think because it's so good at actually measuring it, the club via the camera system that they use, which is unbelievable, by the way. I think it's really, really good for us to use from a TrackMan standpoint. There's nothing wrong with TrackMan. I think it's great. It does have some flaws, kinda, but they're just different. I think I fit off both. I would probably prefer the quad, and I think you start to see a lot more on tour as well. I think some of that is you get the LCD screen right in
Sure.
front of you on the quad,
Yeah,
and so
right.
players could just set it down and ready to rock.
Right.
Um, it's also always normalized, and granted, TrackMan you can normalize it too.
What
But
do you
I
mean by
think
what do you mean by normalized?
conditions,
Oh,
wind,
okay.
yeah. So when I forgot who it was, there was a guy on tour who him and his caddy they were saying how he cracked the top 100. I forgot who it was. He said, well, him and his caddy started using the quad when they were playing their practice rounds to get a better gauge on wind. So if it's 150, and they hit the quad says they hit the ball 150, but it ended up 130 or 170, whatever the wind was doing. They could kind of calculate and better guess on the wind moving forward for the tournament that week.
Hmm.
Because it's always normalized, no wind, no nothing. You're playing golf in a dome
Yeah.
when you're hitting golf balls with the quad.
Interesting.
Yeah,
And so the TrackMan, from everything that just I've read, it is somewhat maybe a more superior unit when it has more space to read things based upon the fact that it does need to be set up behind you and the radar technology can go much further. And so maybe it gives you more indication of, ball flights and directions and things of that nature. Whereas, like you said, if you are looking specifically to fit golf clubs, you want something that is right there that's going to give you the best possible data.
absolutely. It's going to measure what the club is doing, milliseconds
Yeah.
of what club is doing, where the face is pointing, stuff like that. The
Mhm.
downside to obviously the quad is the fiducial system that they have. Um, but from what I understand, there's things in the works to make that part better. I'm not sure what exactly. But to touch on what you said from a TrackMan standpoint, yeah, at certain speeds it could get tough, specifically your higher speeds. If you don't have enough space between where the ball is struck, where the unit is placed, and where the ball hits, um, it does its best to calculate it, but it's not always accurate because of the speed that the ball is coming off at.
Mhm. So irrespective, both of the systems are still operating off of highly complex math equations, essentially.
100%, and I would say they're both reliable.
Mhm.
Um, they do read the data points differently though, and they're not wrong or right, but they're just different. So they read club speeds at different points and ball speeds at different points. So efficiencies and or smash factors are different.
Mhm. And
I
so,
don't want to say TrackMan. I don't want to say it over overachieves ball speed. It's just different, right? And then you can make the argument for quad under reading ball speed, but they're different. They're measured at different points. Um, so I don't know. You can go down a rabbit hole on that stuff pretty quickly.
yeah, it'll be super interesting to see what happens with the advancement in artificial intelligence. Obviously, Callaway's instituted some of that into their face technology now, but we have yet to really see, AI be implemented into launch monitor technology. And I'm sure that when those days come, I mean, I don't know how you're going to get any better.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now TrackMan has optimizer and stuff like that, like which is very useful. And I always think about it. I got this question, a handful of times, within the year is AI from a fitting standpoint. And I think one, I think I want to keep my job. Two, I think no,
Yeah.
two, I genuinely think the biggest thing is one, the relationship that you have with your clients, but the other part of it is just because you are told to try 3 shafts based off of the data that you provide, the height, the whatever the equation is, you're not a robot. And I think that's where the reliability of a fitter, who could help you navigate, is this right or wrong
Mhm.
based off of whatever the data is saying. Um, but I get that one a lot because you could try 3 shafts that on paper, they absolutely work. It says this, it says this. Well, I need that. I need that. I'm at that speed. Should work. And then you try it and it's just so far off. Like it's just, that's not how it works. Unfortunately, fitting is not black and white like that.
No, absolutely. And I think too that, trying to use artificial intelligence to potentially make an imperfect game perfect is kind of beside the point, right? I mean, that's the whole reason that people play this game is they're chasing perfection that will probably never be attained.
Constant chase. You're just constantly chasing, right? You're trying to get better every single time, but it's always it's give and take with
Sure.
some of those things.
And so last question about fitting from, if you're obviously hitting inside of a bay out onto the range. And from what I understand, a lot of that is designed to create completely ideal conditions from a level strike base and everything else to see how people move
Yeah,
that club head.
yeah.
Now, you'd also offer outdoor fittings off of grass turf. What would be some considerations for people to think about when they're trying to decide between one or the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I had a client who exclusively only did outdoor stuff, only plays on turf. Golf's played on turf, so I want to do it on turf. More than you can't argue with that. You're absolutely correct. But then you start talking about variables of turf conditions, the lie of the golf club, or excuse me, of the golf ball. However it is, not everyone has perfect ranges. Then you start talking about golf ball, stuff like that. Um, Again, I have, would be my opinion, the best setup within the company, and there's probably I think there's 3 or 4 similar to mine elsewhere in terms of your indoors in a garage, but you're hitting outdoor where you could see the ball flight. Um, I think if you could control variables from a lie standpoint, from a golf ball standpoint, from a weather standpoint, to an extent, obviously you were somewhat outdoor or somewhat exposed to it, then you're controlling as much as you can without changing you. So you start isolating variables. And I think from a fitting standpoint, that is ideal. Um, that's from a philosophy, from everything. You want to isolate as much as you can, given that the client is a massive variable to it all, right?
Mhm.
But I think it's important to understand when you're hitting off mats, what spin rate is, and why it is sometimes off mats. And if you have a good enough fitter and things like that, you have a general idea of what the ball is doing because of a mat strike, right? Where maybe you hit a little bit behind it, but it still went forward and it looks good on the monitor. We're like, no, that sound is definitely not flush.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting perspective because as we move into our winter season and people start to really get into simulator golf to, get us through our 2 months of no sun depression, I like to call it. But you start to see numbers on a screen, and you start to almost get a little obsessive about well, my spin was high or whatever it is. Now, maybe not so much of a big deal in regards to driver technology because you're striking it off of a tee
Sure.
irrespective of what's going on. But
Yep.
when you're hitting off mats, you really do get a false sense of I'm a pure ball striker sometimes.
You
Okay.
can. You
Yeah.
certainly can. Generally, the mat will, and again, general will produce lower spin rates when you're hitting off it, not off the tee, but off the mat, mainly because the strike occurs slightly higher on the club face. When the strike occurs slightly higher on the club face, you're going to get higher launch, lower spin. You may lose on the ball speed, but so you may get iron shots. You're like, that is really low. I read an article that says you got to be at 6,000. Well, I'm hitting it at 4,500. It's
Right.
like, well, yeah, off a mat, but I promise you on turf, it's closer to that six. It's maybe not six, but it's significantly higher than the 4,500.
Because you get that descent angle, right?
Yeah, yeah. This strike just occurs slightly lower on the club face, which would be ideal. Not low, but more towards center, not high.
Hmm.
And that changes the spin rate by quite a bit.
And so, if somebody's fortunate enough to have some of these tools, like I mean, I own a GC quad. I know
Yeah,
guys up here that own a TrackMan.
yeah.
What are things that they should be keeping in mind? Because, obviously, at a municipal golf course, you're probably not going to be hitting, TP5s, TP5X, Pro V1s at the driving
Sure.
range. But, that's something that I've always had to take into consideration if I'm practicing with a range ball, because the performance models are not designed to take the amount of wear and tear that a range ball does. Fortunately, in your situation, you get the premium golf balls to hit. I would hate to be the golf ball picker that's got to sort through those things, but
Sure.
those are things that matter a lot. I mean, you talk about carry and even some of the ranges that maybe have the reduced distance balls just based upon the length of their range. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think again back to variables. It depends on the range ball. There are range balls that are better than maybe others. It doesn't have to be the premium practice tailor-made ball, but there are range balls that do different things. I would say in general they spin more,
Mhm.
so you're going to see irons with range balls spin quite a bit. But if I'm looking at that at data, it's still apples to apples,
Mhm.
right? So always hit the range ball. My 6 iron, man, on the golf course, it goes 90 or 190, 175. But here on the range, it's going 60 and it's spinning and it's doing all these things. Um, I think the number one thing is being mindful of that. Is like, yeah, it's a range ball. And then the other part is with wedges, because of the cover of the range balls and the way that they are designed, the wedges actually don't spin. They kind of knuckle out of there and they launch
Interesting.
significantly higher. So you get launch conditions, ideally for a wedge in my world that your better players anywhere sub 30 is kind of a good launch number and very general, but somewhere in there, 30 or lower. But you give them a range ball and it's like 32, 33, 34. And it's just like it's climbing out or excuse me, up instead of out.
Mhm.
But then you give them a real golf ball and it just changes drastically. And so
Yeah,
some of that is cover
and that
related.
wedge bounce can play such a big factor and most
Oh,
people just don't understand bounce, right, from a turf condition standpoint. But you know I get a kick out of it anytime I see people that are hitting range balls on a chipping green. You're not getting the same performance
yeah.
out of that range ball on that chipping green.
Yeah.
So,
It's again, it's always just be mindful of it. Like if you could hit a low spinning checker with the range ball, you got some good hands, right? You
mhm,
you know what you're doing, but generally you're just not going to. So is the purpose of the practice session to be just getting patterns? Because
mhm.
then, yeah, great. Keep doing what you're doing. Is the strike acceptable? Are your landing spots acceptable? It checks all the boxes on, except for the ball is now rolling out. It's like, yeah, well, that's okay as long as you're mindful of those things.
Yeah. And so last question for you, Mark. You mentioned, how often you get fit. I don't think there's something else that we touched on, and that's when to replace clubs. And
Yeah.
something that you had brought up to me when I was fitting is I remember specifically saying, "Hey, how my wedges, how often should I be replacing these?" Because if you are getting to that kind of let's say sub five handicap,
Yeah.
you're probably practicing a lot more with your wedges than you realize. And if you're hitting a raw finish wedge or any other kind of wedge, those range balls will deteriorate that wedge face pretty quickly if you're not careful.
Yeah, I mean, especially here in Arizona, we're so sandy.
Mhm.
So then it starts really cutting up the grooves, and I guess not cutting them, dulling them. Specifically, if you play 50 to 100 times a year, you should probably replace them maybe once a year, ideally, but probably every 2 years for sure at that point. Uh, and where you start to notice it though is around the greens exclusively. You start hitting a 50, 60, 70 yard golf shot. Well, there's generally enough speed that, and talking about you specifically too, and probably most, there's enough speed that it's going to produce spin.
Mhm.
It's just going to. Now you go to a green side little bump and run, and if you have old grooves, you could be 5, 6, 7 feet past versus maybe only 3 or 4. So it really starts to poke its head when your grooves are starting to get worn. Is This ball used to kind of check up a little bit. Now it's not releasing, but it's certainly not stopping as quickly as it was previously.
Right. And we're not talking about knuckle shots. We're talking about flush shots that most common golfers are going to be hitting fairly often around the greens. And I mean, I can tell if I absolutely like flush a 15-yard pitch shot and it's soft right off the face and it doesn't grab, that kind of gives me a pause for concern to
Oh,
look down there and say, well, and you can't restore those grooves to the original USGA specs that they have to be if you're going to play any competitive golf.
yeah. And then back to the beauty of what we do is again, true specs. So we keep specs on everything. Um, Whether it was a fitting from 6 years ago to last year to 2 years ago, anything that we've done or built for you and for our clients, we have record of it. So it's always a simple, hey, need new 60. Um, I get some of these junior kids who practice with, and I tell them, but they're like, hey, my 7 or 8 iron is worn. Like,
Hmm.
can you just build me one? And the answer is yes, we always can. Because again, we keep specific build specs, like literally to the weight of the grip that was installed. Um, but I tell them, like, listen, I know you hit a lot of golf balls and your coach wants you to, but can you alternate these?
Yeah.
Because your parents are going to be sick of you pretty soon. But you look at their irons and it's like their 7 iron or 8 iron is just completely shot. Their grooves are done. They're caked over. The plating is gone. And then you look at their 6 iron or their 9 iron, whatever, and it's like, oh, it looks pretty good. So
Yeah.
try and alternate wedges if you can, or excuse me, practice clubs if you can. But again, if you're chipping a lot, it just is what it is.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be, just, I mean, up here, obviously, we face a lot of glacial silt, but we also have a lot of, larger grained soil. And,
Yeah.
those pebbles, whether or not you believe it, that takes its toll. It's not a fine granite sand like you're going to see on tour that these guys are coming
No,
out of.
no.
So, well, Mark, I really appreciate your time today. I think this was unbelievably informative, and the people of Alaska are going to really enjoy it. And if you ever get the bug in your ear to come up and play a mid-am qualifier or something, you should give Alaska a shot.
I heard it's a pretty good place to do it.
Well, yeah, this year will be kind of intense. It's supposed to be a course that Butch Harmon holds the record at, and we're gonna play it at about 7,300, but I gotta tell you, you can't miss.
That's a big one.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. Moose Run Golf Course, the Creek Course. Check it out when you get some spare time.
Yeah, Moose Run, good to know.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely appreciate your time for sure. I'll be sure to include your contact information at the end of the podcast for anyone, as well as on the Instagram, because Marc Roybal, everybody, is fantastic master fitter out of Scottsdale, Arizona at Talking Stick. Can't say enough about how appreciative I am for everything you did last year for me.
Yeah, happy to help. Thanks for having me on, and hopefully I answered all your questions. And if I could help with anyone, any listeners, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. Be
Yeah.
happy to.
Yeah. Appreciate it, man. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your tournament and good luck tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.